electorate. To look at the implications if this deal falls over and a range of other matters, I spoke a short time ago with the Shadow Defence Minister, Andrew Hastie. Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, thanks for joining us. So, in July, Anthony Albanese stood up in Germany and proclaimed this big $1 billion export deal in terms of this German company Rheinmetall building these tanks in Brisbane. Now we hear talks on the contract are suspended because the government's gone with a South Korean company to build our own infantry vehicles in Richard Marles's electorate. I asked the Deputy Prime Minister about this on Sunday. What do you make of it all?
Look, I think it's badly mishandled by the Albanese government. I think it's a test of leadership for Anthony Albanese. This is going to create 700 jobs in Queensland. It's a $1 billion contract. It's, as he said, the largest defence export deal in Australian history. Now it's going to slip through his fingers. So I think it's been badly handled by the government, and it's a test of his leadership now to get it back on track and to seal the deal.
It seems bizarre to have it suspended when, you know, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are involved in this big announcement. What do you put it down to? Look,
we can speculate there might be something to do with Land 400 Phase 3, the awarding of the infantry fighting vehicle contract to Hanwha rather than Rheinmetall. But I've got to say, it all looks very ham-fisted. And again, South Korea is an important ally, Germany is an important ally, and we shouldn't be off-siding people like this. There's enough work out there to keep all our allies happy and busy and building our defence capacity.
Is our relationship with Germany at risk here? I mean, the government's made plenty of hay over Scott Morrison and the French relationship. Do you see something like that evolving out of this?
Look, I've just come from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Security Conference here in Canberra where I spoke, and the relationship is very strong. But nonetheless, this is a test of leadership, and we're needlessly creating trouble in the relationship with this deal and the way it's been handled. And so Anthony Albanese, as our Prime Minister, needs to land this and make it happen.
Now, we had the Defence Strategic Review lead to another review into the Hunter frigates. What do you make of these reports last week? We might get 6 frigates instead of 9 for the same cost, $45 billion.
Well, the government owns this problem and it's theirs to solve. As we saw with the DSR, there was no new money, there was cannibalisation of capability, and there were reviews. And this review will report in September, and then we'll wait for the government to respond to that review, and we're going to comment on that when that happens. But needless to say, again, great uncertainty for defence industry. You talk to any of the defence industry people here now and how they're feeling with the government, there's a lot of uncertainty. They're having to let people go. People are making final investment decisions, and they're looking offshore for work.
Too many reviews in your book?
I just think not the acting Prime Minister, rather, I think the Deputy Prime Minister is distracted. He needs to be a full-time Defence Minister and focus on the job at hand.
And what did you make of the G20 communique that we saw last week and how Anthony Albanese called it the toughest yet on Russia?
I think he's forgotten Bali, frankly. Look, I'm a realist. I understand that it's very hard to get different nations with competing interests at the table and to agree on a communique. It loosely condemned what Russia has done to Ukraine. It upheld the principle of territorial and political sovereignty, but it didn't mention Russia itself. And as you know, across both sides of the aisle here in Australia, we see the invasion of Ukraine as both immoral and illegal by Russia, and we've condemned it in the strongest possible terms.
And do you have a reaction to the Kim Jong-un Putin talks?
Not yet, but suffice to say, anytime these authoritarian leaders get together, it's bad for the free world. As we saw last year in February when President Xi and Vladimir Putin struck a no-limits partnership, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this meeting.
Do you have a view on Anthony Albanese's trip to China?
We welcome dialogue in the coalition. We're glad that China has reversed its decision not to meet with Australian ministers and officials. But again, this is a test of leadership for Anthony Albanese. What can he deliver that's in our national interest? He should be seeking the release of Cheng Lei and Yang Hengjun, 2 Australians long held unjustly by the Chinese government, and he should be working on behalf of Australian exporters to lift some of the sanctions that have been put upon our primary producers.
What do you make of this issue around Qatar Airways that's dominated question time the past couple of weeks and how the government's handled it?
Look, it's concerning, I've got to say. It's not in our national interest, and it's not in the Australian people's national interest. There are serious questions for Catherine King, the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Did she speak to Alan Joyce? She can't recall. She can remember meeting other stakeholders, but what is the quid pro quo here? What is the relationship with Qantas and Anthony Albanese's government that led to them shutting off Qatar and 28 additional flights, foregoing $780 million of economic activity and foregoing a price reduction in flights for Australians? I can tell you, Andrew, I remember the last time I spoke to Alan Joyce. It was down the cafe here back in October, and I was complaining about my flights out of the US. You don't forget a conversation with Alan Joyce, and the Minister is yet to answer that question. Did she have a conversation with him prior to this decision?
She says that Qantas has been more onto her on the labour hire laws. Is that possible?
Potentially.
But is it possible the Minister made the decision on her own and there's no conspiracy here?
There's a whole range of possibilities, but what we're not seeing is transparency. She should be able to justify this decision. And so far, we're not getting the transparency that we and the Australian people expect of our ministers.
A lot of views against the Voice in your home state, WA. What do you think of Peter Dutton's promise of a second referendum on constitutional recognition and how that would be received there?
Well, I think what Peter was restating was our long-held commitment to constitutional recognition. Now, the Prime Minister had a huge opportunity here to bring the nation together around constitutional recognition. But there was no constitutional convention, there was no desire for a bipartisan constitutional amendment. Instead, he's made a mockery of this process. So what Peter was advocating was that very thing, constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians. And sadly, that's going to slip through our fingers because as it looks, the vote no is gaining strength, and this is slipping through the Prime Minister's fingers.
But he says he'll hold a second referendum if elected, so maybe it won't slip through Australians' fingers.
Well, no, there's one question in 5 weeks that needs to be answered. Do you support Anthony Albanese's divisive voice or not? And I urge Australians to vote no, because this is the Prime Minister colluding with the big end of town, big tech, big finance, big sport and big business working together to change our constitution, and the change will be divisive and affect generations of Australians.
Do you personally support a second referendum?
I support constitutional recognition.
Okay, fair enough. Just finally, it seems you're getting a bit more of a run in question time with questions these days. Is Peter Dutton keen to promote you?
Well, I'm sitting at the shadow cabinet table in the defence portfolio, which is a huge honour. The number one role of government is to protect its citizens, and so I'm very glad to serve in that very important portfolio.
Andrew Hastie, thanks for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew.
New South